Something just happened in Iran that satellite imagery cannot hide. Something so large, so visible, and so strategically devastating that every intelligence agency on Earth is analyzing the same footage right now. Multiple explosions, massive fires, secondary detonations that continued for hours. And the location of the strike tells you everything about what just changed in this war. This wasn't a symbolic target. This wasn't a propaganda operation. This was a precision strike on one of Iran's most critical military facilities, and the evidence of what was destroyed is visible from space. Over the next few minutes, you're going to see exactly what got hit, why it matters more than any previous strike in this conflict, and what Iran's response options look like now that this capability is gone. Before we continue, thanks for tuning in. Your support keeps this channel going. Please subscribe and like the video so more people see this analysis. Now let's get into it. On April 3rd, 2026, commercial satellite imagery captured massive fires burning at a facility in Parchin, located approximately 30 kilometers southeast of Tehran. Parchin is not a random location. It's one of Iran's most sensitive military research and production complexes. For decades, international inspectors have suspected Parchin of housing nuclear weapons development programs. Iran has consistently denied this, but the facility has been off limits to inspectors for years, and the level of security around the site has always indicated something more significant than conventional weapons development. The explosions, documented by satellite, occurred in a section of the Parchin complex that had been flagged by Western intelligence as a probable missile production and storage facility. The fires burned for over 6 hours. Secondary explosions were detected throughout that period, which suggests stored munitions or fuel detonating as the fire spread. The smoke plume was visible from commercial satellites, and infrared imaging showed heat signatures consistent with burning chemical propellants, the kind used in ballistic missile fuel systems. Here's what makes this strike different from everything that came before. Iran has been hit repeatedly throughout this conflict. Fuel depots, weapon storage, command centers, even leadership compounds. But most of those strikes targeted things that could be rebuilt, relocated, or replaced relatively quickly. A fuel depot can be restocked, a command center can move to a backup location, even leadership can be replaced, as we saw when Mojtaba Khamenei took over after his father was killed. But a missile production facility is different. These are not simple structures. Building ballistic missiles requires specialized equipment, precision manufacturing tools, clean room environments for guidance systems, and trained personnel who understand the engineering. You can't just move that capability to a new location overnight. If the production infrastructure is destroyed, it takes months or years to rebuild. And if the technical specialists were in the facility when it was hit, that knowledge base is gone permanently. Western intelligence estimates that Iran possessed between 2,000 and 3,000 ballistic missiles at the start of this conflict. Over the past 5 weeks, Iran has launched more than 500 of those missiles at Israel and American targets across the region. That means somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 remain in inventory. And now, the facility that was producing replacements just went up in flames. Let's talk about why that math matters. Iran's entire strategy in this war has been built on missile volume. Overwhelm Israeli and American air defenses with enough projectiles that some percentage gets through. Force the other side to expend expensive interceptors on cheap drones and medium-range missiles, then hit them with the advanced systems when their stockpiles are depleted. It's a war of economic attrition, and it only works if you can sustain the launch rate long enough to exhaust the other side's defensive capability. But sustaining launch rate requires a steady supply of missiles, and if your primary production facility just got destroyed, your supply chain just broke, Iran can still fire the missiles it has in storage, but every missile fired now is one less in the inventory, with no way to replace it in the near term. The strategic calculation just shifted dramatically. Here's the second problem this creates for Tehran. Ballistic missiles are not just offensive weapons. They're also Iran's primary deterrent against deeper strikes into Iranian territory. As long as Iran could credibly threaten to launch hundreds of missiles at Israel or American bases, there was a cost to escalating the conflict further. Any deeper American strike into Iran would trigger a massive missile response that would cause significant damage and casualties. That threat kept certain targets off the table. But if Iran's missile inventory is now finite and declining, and production is stopped, the deterrent value of that arsenal starts eroding. Every missile Iran fires reduces the remaining stockpile. And at some point, the number left becomes too small to constitute a credible mass barrage threat. When that happens, the risk calculation for American and Israeli planners changes. Targets that were previously too dangerous to hit because the retaliatory missile response would be devastating suddenly become viable options, because the retaliation capability is diminished. Iran is now in a use it or lose it situation with its missile force. Fire them now while the inventory is still large enough to matter, or conserve them for deterrence and risk that the other side calls the bluff. Neither option is good. And here's where the intelligence dimension gets even more critical. The strike on Parchin was not a lucky hit. This was a precisely targeted operation that required detailed knowledge of what was inside that facility and where the most critical infrastructure was located. That level of targeting precision suggests either human intelligence from inside the facility or signals intelligence that tracked activity patterns and identified the production areas. Either way, it means Iran's operational security has been penetrated at a level that makes every remaining sensitive facility vulnerable. If one missile production site can be identified and destroyed, so can others. And Iran has to assume that every similar facility is now on a target list somewhere. The Israeli Air Force has demonstrated throughout this conflict that it can reach targets deep inside Iran and strike them with precision. The question was never capability, the question was target selection and intelligence. If the intelligence is there, the strikes will follow. Now let's talk about what this means for Iran's nuclear program, because Parchin has always been more than just a missile facility. International inspectors have suspected for years that Parchin was involved in nuclear weapons research, specifically the development of high explosive lenses used to trigger nuclear detonations. Iran has denied this consistently, but the site has been sanitized multiple times before inspectors were allowed access, and the level of security has always suggested dual-use capability. If the strike on Parchin hit infrastructure related to nuclear weapons development, that represents a threshold crossing that changes the entire character of this conflict. Because up until now, despite all the strikes, despite the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, despite the missile barrages and the naval engagements, both sides have avoided directly targeting nuclear facilities. That was the unspoken red line. You can hit conventional military targets, you can hit leadership, you can even hit research facilities if they're framed as missile production. But explicitly striking nuclear weapons infrastructure is an escalation that signals intent to permanently dismantle Iran's nuclear capability. And if that's what just happened, Iran's response options narrow significantly. Because once nuclear facilities are on the target list, Iran has to assume the entire program is vulnerable. And that creates pressure to either use whatever nuclear capability exists before it's destroyed, or accept that the program is going to be dismantled and there's nothing Iran can do to stop it. The evidence from Parchin suggests the facility is gone. The fires burned too long and too hot for this to be minor damage. Satellite imagery analysts who reviewed the footage described the damage as extensive and consistent with complete structural failure of the targeted buildings. Whatever was being produced, there is not being produced anymore. And whatever technical knowledge was housed in that facility either evacuated before the strike or was lost. Iran's state media has been notably quiet about what happened at Parchin. That silence is significant. When strikes hit less sensitive targets, Iranian media usually reports the attack, claims minimal damage, and broadcasts footage of cleanup operations to demonstrate resilience. The lack of coverage around Parchin suggests this is damage Iran doesn't want to show, which means it's damage that undermines the narrative of Iranian strength and capability. Here's what happens next, and why the timeline matters. If Iran's missile production is genuinely offline, the current inventory becomes a wasting asset. Every day that passes without production coming back online is a day the stockpile shrinks through combat usage without replenishment. That creates pressure to either escalate immediately and use the missiles while the numbers still matter, or shift strategy entirely and pursue a diplomatic off-ramp before the leverage disappears completely. Iran has signaled no interest in diplomacy, which suggests they're preparing for escalation. But escalation with a depleting arsenal is a gamble. If the escalation doesn't achieve a decisive result quickly, Iran will be in a worse position than before, with fewer missiles, no production capability, and an adversary that has proven it can strike Iran's most sensitive facilities with precision. The alternative is to accept that the missile-centric strategy has failed and pursue asymmetric options. That could mean increased attacks on shipping, cyber operations against critical infrastructure, or activating proxy forces in ways that haven't been used yet. All of those options carry their own risks. But they don't burn through the finite missile stockpile the way continued barrage operations do. The United States and Israel are watching Iran's next moves very carefully, because the response to Parchin will tell them whether Iran is doubling down on the current strategy or shifting to something new. If Iran launches a massive missile response in the next 48 to 72 hours, that signals they're committing the remaining inventory to a decisive push. If Iran holds fire and looks for alternative pressure points, that suggests they've accepted the missile strategy is no longer viable and they're adapting. Either way, the destruction of Parchin just changed the strategic picture in ways that cannot be reversed. Production capability is not something you rebuild in weeks. The technical expertise lost in a strike like this takes years to replace. The equipment destroyed takes months to procure, even if you have unlimited funds. And Iran is operating under the tightest sanctions regime in its history, which means acquiring specialized manufacturing equipment is exponentially harder than it would be under normal conditions. This is not recoverable damage in the time frame that matters for this conflict. This is a permanent degradation of capability that will define Iran's options for the rest of the war. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand what just changed, because the media coverage is going to focus on the explosions, the fires, and the dramatic satellite imagery. But the real story is what those fires represent. The destruction of irreplaceable production capability, the loss of technical infrastructure that took decades to build, and the strategic shift that happens when your primary offensive weapon system can no longer be replenished. Iran just lost something it cannot get back. And every missile they fire from this point forward is one less they'll have when this conflict enters its next phase. That's not a temporary setback. That's a permanent strategic disadvantage, and both sides know it. Thanks for watching. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Iran will escalate immediately with what they have left, or shift to a different strategy? Subscribe for continued analysis, and I'll see you in the next one.